So here we are at week 2 of exploring the anxious attachment style. So I'm going to start today by just reviewing a little bit of what we did at the end of last week. I'm going to repeat some stuff when we started on discussing the anxious attachment style, because that is all we are focusing on tonight, is basically really diving into this style, and we're going to talk about some nitty-gritty stuff. So, like we said last week, the anxious attachment style person is known for falling in love hard, fast, and easily. And they find their unions to be a struggle, often resulting in heartache and self-doubt. The style is a result of having childhood needs inconsistently met by caregivers. They may have been responded to with excessive love and affection at times, and then other times not responded to at all. And the other factor that has to do with this attachment style is the so-called emotional hunger of the caregivers. And that's when they are seeking to have their own emotional and physical needs met by the child instead of the other way around. And so they might appear to be intrusive or overprotective parents. They might use the child to satisfy their own hunger for love, or to present their own selves in a certain light, like as the perfect parent. And therefore the child is just an extension of them and not their own individual person. But like I said last week, we're focusing on those who did not have their emotional needs consistently met by their caregivers for this class. Oops. Never knowing when their needs would be met, these children lived in constant fear of emotional abandonment. As adults, they continue to have a significant need for validation, affirmation, and especially reassurance. They're impulsive and highly emotional, and they require very high levels of contact and intimacy, emotional and physical, within relationships. Typically, they hold a negative self-view of themselves, though not, consistently always, but that's a general rule of thumb. And they often view most others in a positive light. This is where we get that I am not good enough, I am less than kind of attitude, because we think that everybody else is up on this pedestal while we're down crawling around in the dirt. So therefore, codependency is common. Here's our favorite red flag box, because for anxious attachers, there is no better show of value than to be needed by someone else. As they rely on others to regulate their emotions, the anxiously attached will pressure themselves to have relationships regardless of compatibility. Red flags are totally ignored, as attention or being made to feel special is all that's needed to trigger their attachment response. Once they feel those butterflies and sparks, they are instantly in love. Little do they realize that the exciting feeling of chemistry isn't chemistry at all, it's anxiety. That is the triggered attachment response. We think it's love, we think it's all this and that. It is a biological response that's being triggered in our brains. So let's take a look at some common thought traps of the anxiously attached. Thought traps are cognitive distortions, which are thought patterns that cause people to view reality in an inaccurate and usually negative way. It's thought that these patterns develop as a way of coping with adverse life events. However, these thoughts are not healthy long-term. So as a child, these things are what helped us survive, right? This is how we made it through our childhood, because we couldn't just walk away from our parents. We needed them for survival. So, these are not all of the cognitive distortions or thought traps of the anxiously attached, but they're the 5 most common. So the first one is personalization, which is just what it sounds like, taking something personally when there are other possible reasons for the situation. For example, he hasn't texted me back yet. I must have done something wrong. I used to think that all the time, not necessarily that I did something wrong, but just that something must be wrong. And that would trigger my anxiety, and I would have to reach out and kind of dig and overdo it. Mind reading, assuming you know someone's thoughts or what they will say. For example, I know she's going to tell me I'm stupid or wrong for feeling this way. That's some of the biggest problems in so many relationships, not just for the anxiously attached, but because we don't communicate and we make assumptions. So many crazy things in this world would probably not happen if we just communicated honestly with each other, but that's difficult to do when you have these cognitive distortions. Predicting negative outcomes, worst case thinking, always believing that the person you're dating is going to abandon you. Therefore, you brace yourself for the heartache before it even happens. Like you just can't win no matter what you do. Delusions, holding tightly to false beliefs, despite all of the evidence against them. For example, holding on to the belief that your partner will change when all realistic evidence suggests otherwise. I'm sure if you all had your cameras on right now, we'd be raising our hands to that one. And emotional reasoning, using your feelings to guide your thoughts and decision making. For example, I feel there must be something wrong, therefore it must be. Another example is the fact that we stay with these people because we feel like we love them. So despite what our intellectual mind is telling us, we are following what we think our heart is telling us. And it's the exact opposite that the dismissive avoidant does. They rationalize their emotions. So if they feel something, they'll flip it around and just use their logic brain instead of feeling something. So triggered attachments response. Because these cognitive distortions that we just looked at have been reinforced for over a lifetime, right? Our entire lives, we've been believing these cognitive distortions. I'm going to just restart because I know Carolyn just entered the room. So because these cognitive distortions have been reinforced over our entire lives, we just believe this to be the truth. They can result in increased anxiety, depression, and create more havoc within our relationships. By vigilantly monitoring their partner, by having that becoming an art form as they continuously look for subtle changes in behavior, which to them are clues of impending abandonment, these small changes in their partners often get blown out of proportion as the attachment response is triggered. So for the anxious attacher, when their attachment response is triggered, this is what they do. The emotions hijack them and they manifest as clingy, jealous, or obsessive behavior. Think about the over texting and that graphic that I showed you at the end of last week. Constantly having your partner on your mind, you can't stop thinking about them, needing that frequent contact, reaching out all the time, wanting to spend every moment together that you can, getting upset when they don't want to spend time with you, if they're going out and doing something with someone else, if that bothers you, if you don't have that freedom to kind of breathe and do your own thing. That's a sign of that. Another sign of a triggered attachment response, you might resort to manipulation, such as trying to provoke jealousy. Gosh, I used to do that one all the time, where then I would start talking about another guy or talking about something else and trying to get that to elicit them to be worried about losing me. Didn't work. Or, by not answering their texts on purpose, even though it kind of kills you to not answer the text, you might do that as in a way to manipulate them to give you the attention that you need. Or constantly initiating communication and acting jealous yourself, all in an effort to get your partner to express commitment in the way you want them to. This behavior feels primal and uncontrollable, and it can be shame-inducing for the anxiously attached. The constant need for assurance of love can often be what causes their partner to do the one thing they fear the most, and that's leave. Wanting intimate relationships so badly, their overwhelming efforts end up perpetuating that lifelong cycle of that fear of abandonment, as the obsessive nature of these relationships causes their mates to feel smothered and pressured, and it's just a stressful pattern of heartbreak. Having an insecure attachment style can be very tiring. It can feel like you're on an emotional roller coaster all the time. Relationships might be both life-saving and life-threatening. On one hand, the fear of being alone or being rejected is the poison. It's a disturbing feeling, which leads to that constant doubt and worry. On the other hand, the presence of a loved one, and more importantly, their demonstration of affection, is the remedy. So this all revolves around the relationship, not yourself. How are we doing, Kathy? Any questions or comments?
There was one comment for Kate. She said, "Oof, the manipulation."
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you don't even realize necessarily that that's what's happening, because it's so primal, right? You just need that connection. It's almost like being addicted, right, to drugs or food or whatever your addiction is. We're so used to this pattern, we don't even really understand what's happening. We just need it. Oh, self-reflection. We're here already. So we're going to stop here for a moment and just do some self-reflection, thinking about those thought traps. And I might actually go back to them. Oops. Here they are. So review the thought traps again. Do any of these thought traps or behavior descriptions sound familiar? You don't have to answer out loud. You can put it in the chat if you want, or you can just think about it to yourself, or you can write it down in your notebook. This self-reflection, like I have repeated and I will keep saying, is the most important part of this journey. You have to look inward. You have to be able to identify your behaviors if you want to change your behavior and the outcomes of all of this. So I'll share a little bit myself. For me, the part about vigilantly monitoring your partner becoming an art form is the bullseye for me. I can tell something's off before it's even said. And sometimes I tell it's off because nothing was said. You know, it's like I become a mind reader almost. And it's just the most subtle change in behavior. I'm on it and I know something's up. It became like a radar, whether I was right about it or not. Now, that being said, I was usually right about it because I would choose the fearful avoidant to partner up with. So my attempts at intimacy would actually make them feel panicked and they would be getting ready to step away. And so I got really good at picking up on that, you know. And so when you're used to having somebody walk away from you as soon as they make you fall in love with them, you become vigilant for watching that. And the personalization, I absolutely personalized my partner's behavior. And that was also usually appropriate because I tended to match up with those fearful avoidants who really were just like plotting their getaway. But also inappropriately at times. For example, if they didn't return my texts, my mind would instantly begin going down that rabbit hole. You know, are they upset with me? Are they losing interest? Are they out with someone else? When really they were just busy, you know, they weren't around their phone or something like that. And it sounds unreasonable to the average person, I know, but once I was triggered or once my attachment response was triggered, and just putting that vocabulary on it made me feel better because it didn't feel like there was something wrong with me once I understood that this is normal for a triggered anxious attachment response. So just having the vocabulary is helpful. It really did feel like it was primal and uncontrollable. I couldn't help my behavior, or so I thought. At the time, I couldn't help it, but as we'll learn, you certainly can begin to change it so that you can help it. And there was a huge shame component involved for me revolving around my behavior. I'd send lengthy text after text, like a book, to these guys, and then just beat myself up for doing that. And then I would text them again, even after I beat myself up. And it just became this cycle of me trying to manipulate and overconnect when I knew I should be walking away. My intellectual brain knew I should be walking away, but my emotional brain, my amygdala, my attachment style that was triggered just would not let that happen. And so I just kept texting and calling and emailing and writing letters. It was humiliating, and I kept doing it. But in my mind, I was thinking, if I just find the right way to explain things, or if I word it just right, if I can just get through to them, they'll understand, and we'll be able to have this loving relationship that I just knew we were supposed to be having. Because why wouldn't we be having it? You know, this is the person I feel this way with, and I know that they have feelings for me, so this is supposed to be happening. So when a secure person would have just walked away, I clung even tighter to the relationship like a life raft, fearing that if love was lost, I would be alone forever. I didn't think I would ever feel that way again about someone else. So stopping the attempts at connection was as hard as stopping smoking. I was an addict. Kathy, we have some comments.
We do have some comments.
All right.
Michael said, predicting negative outcomes equals planning for a projected worst case scenario.
Mhm.
And Carolyn said, predicting a negative outcome, personalization would be my thought traps. And Shanine said, personalization is a big one for me. And Kate, definitely feel the primal and the shame with that. Always thought there was something wrong with me, calling myself Jodi Arias.
What did she call herself?
Jodi Arias?
I
I
don't
might
know.
be pronouncing it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, all of that is so true, right? And when you think about, like, especially the personalization, that this is not just limited to romantic relationships, right? Like, how often do we take things personal, like at work or with our friends? You can have a triggered attachment response with your friends. I did it all the time. If I saw that my friends were out doing something and they didn't include me, I felt so rejected. I felt like unlovable, that like all of those feelings that would come up when I would be dumped by a boyfriend would rise up when my friends would do something without me, because I felt like they didn't want to be with me. So I took that personally, you know, and predicted the negative outcomes. And so this is not just limited to romantic relationships. I'm not saying that we behave that way with all of our friends. You know, we don't have that triggered attachment response with everybody, unless we're hanging out with people who have avoidant tendencies. Then we will. You know, but if you have a friend who is secure, they might not trigger that in you. And so as you go through life after this, you'll start paying attention to your friends and kind of dissecting them, figuring out what type of attachment style they have. I think this thought trap piece is such a great tool for us. So I think that you guys should definitely cut this one out and keep it handy, so that when you find yourself triggered or beating yourself up in any situation in life, you can pull this out and say, am I doing one of these things? Because if you can identify it, you'll be able to tell what's real and what's a product of your cognitive distortion. And that's kind of the goal in all of our healing journeys, is to figure out what is the truth and what is the story my mind is making up. That's a huge component of Brene Brown's books, all of them. The story I'm telling myself in my head is, and she'll even suggest saying that to, you know, your partner, you know, asking them, what is going on? Because the story I'm telling myself is that I think her example was like that you think I don't look good in my bathing suit anymore. You know, she had all of these thoughts going on in her head when her husband wouldn't answer her when they were out for a swim. But really, he was thinking about how he had all this responsibility on the vacation with the kid. It had nothing to do with what she was thinking. So just keep that in mind as you go through life after this class. Let me just fast forward again to wherever we were. Self-reflection. All right. Is there any other questions or comments, Kath?
Someone said, I love that book, Jamie. Good examples. 17813. I forgot the name.
I
Who's
think that's
behind that
Karina.
number?
Yeah.
Karina.
And I will quote Brene Brown all the time, and I will never be able to tell you which book I'm quoting. They all blur into one big book for me, and I have them all in Audible, and I'll just pop one on in the car, and I don't know which one I'm listening to, and they all pretty much talk about the same thing, but in a different way, and I love it all. I haven't read Atlas of the Heart yet, but that's on my list. All right. Oh, I had put that in there again. I didn't need to rewind. Look at how. So, this is our breakout session. And let me see. So what I'm going to do is create a couple of rooms. You guys do not have to share anything that you don't want to share. You know, you can be very vague if you want, but consider sharing details, just because that is how all of this behavior is fear-based, right? And most everybody's behavior in life is fear-based in one way or another. And we're so conditioned to not talk about the things that might be judged, or things that might make others think differently about us, things that cause shame. And it really is shame that keeps us from wanting to share things. But you know, we are all in this class together, and that means that we all have had an anxious attachment style. So, you know, the things that you shared in the chat box, I'm going to just pair you guys up, and you can spend like 5 minutes each or so, 5 or 6 minutes, trying to recall actual instances. Okay. Like pick a particular partner and say, oh, this is how I used to behave in that. I'm now identifying a cognitive, you know, distortion that I didn't realize I had before. And anything like that, you know, and just remember that when we're listening to people, we want to listen with empathy. That means, you know, not speaking over them, giving the validation, don't cut them off with your own story, things like that. So just give me a second to create these. We're just waiting for the last two to come back to us. All right. So I want to ask how that went without asking how that went. Because I'm going to just keep you guys on mute. But I hope it felt kind of good, even if it was uncomfortable sharing with somebody who gets it, right? I think that's so important is during this process of self-growth is surrounding yourself with the right people. And so people who don't understand, they don't have to necessarily understand what you're going through, but people who can't listen to you speak your truth with empathy probably aren't the right people to be speaking your truth to. So that's just something to keep in mind. I remember feeling super uncomfortable sharing this stuff for the first time and like, God, like nobody was going to like me once they knew what I had to say. And, you know, the only people who didn't like me after I said what I had to say, after I spoke my truth, was the people that gave all of this shit to me in the first place. Right. So they didn't like me talking about it, but everybody else, I think it made them like me a little bit more, just to know that I have suffered and that I felt that way about myself, and people kind of rallied around me. So you might be surprised. Something that I wrote down today as I was reviewing this section of us doing our breakout room, because I just look at that one for delusions, holding tightly to false beliefs. Like that one really, I think, is probably, even though all of them I relate to, I think that one's the most powerful because it's hard to let go of those beliefs. You know, it's really hard. They're ingrained as part of our identity. So what I wrote today, my break at work, I said, I was often told I was too much or too needy or too wordy. And at the end of the day, I was left feeling unlovable, which is how I had felt ever since I was a little kid, constantly seeking love from those who were unable to freely give it to me, all the while praying that they would freely give it to me. And as an adult, this was while I already had men who were interested in freely giving it to me, but I didn't want it from them. I wanted it from the ones who couldn't. I fantasized love, which is part of this delusion category. And I held tightly to the belief that someone loving me was the remedy for all that was wrong with me, even though I could never quite pinpoint what it was that exactly was wrong with me. Fantasizing love makes perfect sense. If we don't have secure love given to us as children, or even realistically modeled to us as children, all we have left is our imaginations to try and figure out what that is supposed to look and feel like. And, you know, that's something I carried with me right up until recently, you know, that love was this mystical thing that was going to cure everything. And that any man that showed attention to me was going to be the guy that was going to give me that. Even when all of their actions showed otherwise, I thought that I could change them into what I needed. And how exhausting is that, right? So let me just, Kathy, you got something?
Yes, Carolyn mentioned about the breakout rooms. It was a little uncomfortable at first, but helpful once we get started. Then she said, love cures everything in the movies, doesn't it?
Yeah, doesn't it? Yeah, movies don't help, do they? And I'm glad to hear kind of that you were uncomfortable at first, because that's how we grow, is by pushing ourselves through these uncomfortable things. You know, in the right scenario where it's a safe place to do so, you know, not pushing yourself into something uncomfortable, like a bad relationship uncomfortable, but I'm glad that you did it. And I'm glad that you were able to share and that you survived that awkwardness. You know, years ago, I don't think I would have shared a damn thing, because I just wasn't, I was too afraid. I was too afraid. So let me did that. Oh, look how deep we're going now. I think this is where I wrote, okay, let's dive a little bit deeper into the behaviors of the anxiously attached and talk about sex. Well, okay, let's dive a lot deeper. It's almost impossible to thoroughly review this attachment style without discussing sex, which I know is something that we were previously conditioned to not talk about, but sex is a biological function and we're doing it. So, sex is an important part of a healthy relationship. For those who are secure, sex is approached with both partners paying attention to each other's cues with the goal of both parties feeling mutually satisfied. Sex, for securely attached people, is used to enhance the already secure relationship. For anxious attachers, sex is often used for approval. Another good comparison is that sex is used somewhat like currency, and not in the prostitute sense, but as an exchange for love or connection. As they're typically obsessively focused on worrying about how they are perceived by their partner, as well as the strong desire for close proximity and connection, sex is a way to manipulate those needs being fulfilled by their partner. I know for me, this fact was spot on. I used sex as a way to try and get men to love me. And I tried to become really good at it so that that would manipulate them into wanting me as their girlfriend and wanting to treat me the way I wanted them to treat me. And every single time I was left disappointed, but gosh darn it, I kept trying. It allows them to feel desired and obtain the physical intimacy they crave. I mean, of course, when somebody is participating in sex, you're getting all of the attention. They are attracted to you, and this is what you want in a mate. But you just want it after the sex too. So these results do not last. Add the naturally negative expectations towards their mates to their already low self-esteem, and you'll find most anxious attachers feeling unsatisfied after sex. This is because those fears are still there once the sex is over, and sometimes even stronger after the partner leaves and the thought traps kick in, because the expectations that we place on that episode of sex is not realistic, and it does not meet our expectations afterwards. However, despite the unsatisfying sex, anxious attachers repeat the scenario over and over. At the beginning of a relationship, they often find themselves truly extremely sexually attracted to their partners. This could be attributed to their tendency to base their feelings of intimacy on fantasy instead of reality. Anxious attachers are pros at falling in love with potential. Once the extreme phase of sexual attraction passes, the activated attachment response continues to be triggered as they work overtime to change their partner into who they need them to be. In an attempt to avoid rejection, they will consent to or initiate sex regardless of sexual desire and tend to spend the entire time focused solely on pleasing their partner in an effort to prove their worth and earn that elusive love. Of course, when one lives in a constant state of worry and anxiety, satisfying sex is usually off the table. That's because a dysregulated nervous system makes physically enjoying sex nearly impossible. And then not enjoying sex in itself can be shame-inducing. So are you noticing the cycle here? Kathy, I see a number on the chat. Is there something we should talk about at this little break here?
The only thing I see on the chat is about the movies.
Okay. Thank you. So this is from the Attachment Project, And these are 10 common signs, though not all, and you don't always have to have these signs, but they're common signs of anxious attachment in bed. So that's engaging in unwanted sex in adolescence as an attempt to prevent abandonment. I'm guilty of that one for sure. Earlier first intercourse and more sexual partners. Should I just keep my hand up for this whole thing? Engaging in sexual activity to satisfy the need for security and love. Using sex to seek proximity, approval, and reassurance. Using sex to provoke your partner's attentiveness and availability. Low self-esteem and lower perceived attractiveness. Being unfaithful to your partner. That one's hit or miss, I think. That wasn't a big one for me, but it could be. Emotional unpredictability and falls in love easily. Extreme sexual attraction, jealousy, and feelings of obsession, and a negative perception of sexual experiences and disappointing sexual interactions. So let's do some self-reflection again on this. That's a lot to digest there and think about. And like I said, not all of those have to be at play here for you to have an anxious attachment style, okay? So just think about all the times you've had sex in your life. And I don't expect you to think about every single time because that would probably be a lot of times. But just think in general about whether or not you felt dissatisfied after sex. Not necessarily physically dissatisfied, though that is a component here too. If physical dissatisfaction, easy for me to say, is a theme in your life revolving around sex, think about the fact that it's really difficult for a person to actually orgasm if their nervous system is dysregulated. And so what does that mean? Let's say you're in fight or flight mode. I think we're all familiar with that, even though there's actually, it's not just fight or flight, it's fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Conversation for another day, but that's your amygdala response. That's your fear response in your brain. That's what drives us to do all of these behaviors that we're going to try to rewire. So if that is dysregulated, right, your nervous system is dysregulated because you're activated, you have that triggered anxious attachment response happening. You know, that fight or flight doesn't only happen when we're being attacked or something like that. It happens when we're triggered and we don't feel emotionally safe or we're afraid of something. And that's what this is all about. We're afraid of abandonment. We're afraid of the loss of attachment when we have this style. So like if we're anxious about our partner leaving us or not desiring us or worrying about whether they're going to stay, or if we're feeling shame for not being good enough or lovable enough or whatever it is we've been feeling, you know, that's your nervous system being dysregulated. And it's very difficult for a lot of people to find sexual pleasure and complete the act of sex with an orgasm when that nervous system is dysregulated. So I'll share a little bit of vulnerability here. This was a huge issue for me my entire life. And it's not just about the anxious attachment style. You know, I have a childhood sexual abuse history, and add that to living in a narcissistic home. And, you know, so many things factor into my attachment style. You know, I had an issue with not physically enjoying sex, you know, for decades. And I ended up faking it most of the time, or 100% of the time up until my 40s, because I knew that that was a way for me to manipulate men into potentially loving me, or I thought that was a way. And there is a huge shame issue about not being able to enjoy sex, you know, and that just compounds the problem. So, but if you don't have that problem, you can think about feeling dissatisfied after sex in the form of not having that emotional security from your partner that you're expecting or desiring from them. And again, I can completely relate to that, where, you know, even after I started doing this work and got divorced and entered one of my first relationships after getting divorced, I was expecting that after sex, that would kind of cement the deal, that this person would finally relax enough from his anxious, fearful, avoidant attachment style to allow our relationship to happen in the way that I knew we both wanted it to. And that didn't happen. And so immediately after sex, I had this big cloud over my head. And I felt ashamed and I felt not good enough. And what's wrong with me? Why can't I get this guy, or any guy in my entire life to just freaking love me and make me feel lovable? And that's sad. It's sad to feel that way. So we are not going to do breakout rooms and talk about our disappointing sex lives. Unless that's something that you guys want to do, I can set that up. But it's just something to self-reflect upon. And when we're thinking about how do we want the rest of our life on this earth to be, do we want to keep repeating these patterns of disappointment, or do we want to try and do something about it? And that's why we're here. So the purpose of this sex part is to recognize our patterns. If you have a history of feeling disappointed after sex, particularly when that sex is with someone you really care about, it's time to decide on whether or not you really want to change that. Because we tell ourselves, if only they would act the way I need them to act, I'd be happy, right? But is that really right? Think about all the people we've passed up just because we weren't attracted to them or we didn't feel chemistry with them. So if it was really true that if they acted the way we wanted and showed us attention and that would make us happy just by them treating us right, that's not true. Because if it was, we'd be attracted to the people who want to do that, right? So that's one of those cognitive distortions that we need to work on changing. It's not about changing the other person and then they're going to make us whole. It's about us making ourselves healed enough so that we are attracted to secure love. This week's homework. I want you to write down how it felt to share your thought traps and behaviors with your classmates today. And also think about how it felt to listen to them share theirs. So this is probably conversation that you haven't had in this kind of dynamic before. And when you write this down, I want you to include emotionally descriptive words. And these are just examples: embarrassing, confident, relieved, uncomfortable, sad. There's a great thing, you can Google it. I probably should have included it on here. It's called the emotions wheel. And you can Google that for some awesome words, and it shows it in layers around the circle, and you can see where each emotion kind of stems from a primary emotion. So you can have a secondary and a tertiary emotion that stems from this one main one. I'll have to remember to put that in there. And I'd like for you to write down, and if anything surprised you today, and explain what surprised you, why it surprised you, so what was the previous thought pattern, and what is something that you might have realized that's new about you tonight. Or just what surprised you about how you felt sharing. We're trying to just get comfortable in this pattern of talking about what's happening in our lives, instead of stuffing it down and hiding it. Can you identify patterns of your thoughts or behaviors which you would like to change? Write them down, and then write down the thoughts and behaviors you'd like to change them to. So what are you thinking and how are you behaving now? And what do you want to be thinking and behaving in the future? And try to put them kind of like side by side, almost like you have two columns, okay? You can do one with an arrow and the other. We are going to start, this is the process of manifesting this changed behavior. Next to each thought or behavior you'd like to change, write down where you learned this mindset from. If this is difficult, think back to your childhood. Sometimes it's just a feeling that is similar. You might not remember the exact moment that taught you this, but every behavior that we have, we learned somewhere. And it might take some digging to figure that out. And if you end up not doing this homework assignment, or you only want to do part of it, that last one is probably the most important one to do. We need to figure out where we got our behavior patterns and our thought processes from in order to change them. Kathy, I think we got some questions.
You do have one comment from Karina. It says, Jamie, thank you for sharing your vulnerabilities with us. It helps us not feel so alone or so different. And it says here again, thank you to my breakout partner for being open and vulnerable and so compassionate with me.
Oh, I love that. I that whole being brave, being afraid and doing it anyway is definitely a superpower. You kind of become untouchable when you can learn how to do that. And, certainly me sharing my difficulties with sex my whole life, I think what can be worse than sharing something like that? I'm sure there is something worse, but that's pretty vulnerable. And I share it because, God, the shame that was attached to sex with me, it's almost hard to put words on what it's like to live a life where you have a shame binding with sexual pleasure. Definitely felt like, and not even to do with relationships, I just felt like a defective woman, like one more thing that was wrong with me because nobody else has any issues enjoying sex. But, come to find out, yeah, actually a lot of people have issues enjoying sex. And once I learned about the dysregulated nervous system, I learned that from my therapist consulted a sex therapist. And as soon as she gave me that one piece of information, sometimes it just takes one sentence from somebody to change your perspective. And then I realized, oh, there's not something wrong with me. There's a reason for that. My nervous system's dysregulated. And she was right. Once I was able to change my patterns and find a secure relationship that I felt safe in, I don't have that problem anymore. And it's freaking awesome. I love sex now. Kathy, I can actually see the chats now.
Okay, you see the chats? Okay.
Yeah. It's only when I'm not sharing the screen that I can't see them.
Perfect.
Yeah, so see, people can relate. That's why I share this stuff, because somebody needs to give other people permission to share and to realize that they're not alone and that there is nothing wrong with any of us. Even the biggest assholes in the world, like, yeah, there's something wrong with them, but they're that way because somebody wounded them. Doesn't mean we have to let them in our lives, and we certainly need boundaries with people like that, but they're not born that way. I mean, I guess a few people are born as sociopaths, but the majority of people are just wounded, right? And so there's nothing technically wrong with all of us, but once, that's right, Shani, and hurt people. But once we realize where this behavior comes from, right? And then if we decide to not do anything about it, well, then that is on us, right? We can understand where we learned these feelings and behavior from and who caused what. And so that helps us take the blame off of ourselves for being defective or broken or whatever. But then after that, we can't keep blaming them, right? At some point, we have to take responsibility for our own lives and our own healing. And part of this attachment theory stuff is that we are expecting these other people to heal us. And that is never going to happen. The secure mindset is that a relationship is going to enhance my already kick-ass life. And so that's my goal for you guys. So our goal for our homework this week and after this class is to return next week with a solid sense of awareness about ourselves and the ability to recognize patterns in our partners. Next week, we will learn about the most common dysfunctional relationship pairing, which is the anxious avoidant relationship. All right. Thank you so much, guys. Does anybody have anything they want to say? I can unmute you if you do. Raise your hand. If not, yeah. Thank you, Michael. Bye, guys. I'll see you all next week. Reach out to me if you have any questions, okay? Bye, Carolyn. Bye, Karina. Bye, Kate. Bye, Shanine. Bye, Arnie and Michael.